Welcome to Baker Briefing, where we make the news make sense. I'm David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. For today's episode, we're sharing a condensed version of a conversation I had in December with Ben Ginsberg, one of the nation's foremost experts on electoral law and a central figure in the Bush v. Gore litigation, which gave the White House in 2000 to George W. Bush. He joined us for our annual elections conference, co-hosted with the Carter Center on December 8th, to revisit that historic dispute and discuss contemporary challenges in the United States to election results, procedures, from mail-in ballots to partisan redistricting. You can listen to the full hour-long conversation on our YouTube channel, along with our other panels from the conference. Just click the link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in.
Let's start with a little context. 25 years after Bush v. Gore, the various state and then Supreme Court decisions that shaped the outcome, what was its long-term impact? Does it or does it not play a role, sui generis, part of a process, in taking us to where we are today in terms of questions regarding the elections process?
Excellent question. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. So Bush versus Gore is a simple jurisprudential matter, has not had a tremendous input or an effect. It has been cited more in the briefs of litigators than it has been in the decision of judges. On the other hand, it certainly was a unique event. It was a watershed event. There really hadn't been anything like that since 1876. And so that had an impact on the country. It was obviously extremely combative in Florida, two sides arguing, doing all the things you do in a recount in a fever-pitched manner. But at the end of the day, it ended peaceably. There were no tanks in the streets. There were no riots at the Capitol. Al Gore did perhaps the most difficult thing I've ever seen in politics and give an incredibly gracious speech. I think we all appreciated the institutions and frameworks of the government of the United States and what it was, and behaved accordingly. So you can also, I think, talk a little bit about the arc of the country since probably the 1960s and the way we are today, and see some connections to Bush versus Gore. It was a pivotal moment, but it had both positive and negative impacts.
Ben, I want you to talk a little bit as we examine context about the various clocks that we're running within the Florida state system, within the federal system, including the Electoral College clocks. And I say that from a perspective some of you in the room may have shared. I was overseas as an ambassador at that time, following this all, as was my host country, very closely. And there was a sense of shock from that distance that the Supreme Court, and I use the terms advisedly, cut short a process as opposed to letting it run to a natural outcome. You want to comment on this?
Sure. Well, to start with, you need to look at it in the context of what the Constitution says, which is there will be a new president inaugurated on January 20th, and that the term of the old president ends. And then within the Electoral College, and of course there are many debates on the advisability of the Electoral College, but the Electoral College was the rules of the road when we were going through this, and there was a safe harbor date that had to be met.
What does that mean?
Safe harbor date is when the states, if they get their slate of electors into the archivist, get it done in the states and then to the archivist on a certain date, which I think was December 19th that year, then there is a presumption that those slates were accurate. And so all states wanted to meet that safe harbor, so there wasn't a lot of conflict over who would be allowed to vote in the Electoral College. The state of Florida also had a date in its statutes for when the election had to be certified to move on to be able to get the slate of electors for the Electoral College. And one of the things that the U.S. Supreme Court said in its decision was that the Florida Supreme Court had usurped the power of the Florida legislature and created a new deadline 12 days later than the one in the statute. And the U.S. Supreme Court felt that a Florida court could not do that, didn't have the authority to do it.
And your comment on the, quote, premature, close quote, cutting off of a, quote, natural process of reviewing those hanging checks.
Well, there's to take everyone back to the tumult of Florida at that time. You remember that there were many of those sort of flimsy paper ballots with those little chads on them. And there were people in counting houses holding them up and examining them. It was a process that was not consistent in the way it was applied. In other words, similarly marked ballots were counted differently in the different counting houses, both in each county and between the four counties who were counting. It was not a simple matter of letting the process play out. First of all, there wasn't adequate time, the Supreme Court said, and I think it's right, to get things done by the safe harbor deadline. It was also true that the counting houses were sufficiently chaotic and inconsistent that there was no uniform set of standards. So equal protection claims and evidence that we had of similar ballots being marked differently depending on who they were cast for would have been part of the court proceedings and would have been an awfully chaotic process. And so the Supreme Court, in both upholding Florida law, saying that the Florida Supreme Court couldn't act as a legislature, and the lack of rules that they put into the process, all led, I think, rightly to the decision to cut things down and go ahead with the certification.
I want to get back to the physical mechanics of how the votes were tallied, then how votes are tallied today in terms of systems in a moment. But let's talk about the role of Secretary Baker in all of this.
Yes. Secretary Baker was our leader and just a unique and incredible bundle of different talents. He was a Supreme Court expert. He knew the jurisprudence for the U.S. Supreme Court. He looked at things with a litigator's eye, which is a rarely found skill of people to be both an appellate lawyer and a great litigator. He, of course, was a savvy political operative from having run national presidential campaigns. He was perhaps the best communicator of his generation. And those skills were absolutely remarkable. He was really good, the best I've seen, at being able to both see the big picture and sweat the details at the same time. And that proved absolutely invaluable to the effort in that incredibly tense 36-day period.
What was the relationship between the team as a whole, Secretary Baker as the head, and the other side?
Very interesting question, especially given our polarized times today. Secretary Baker and Secretary Warren Christopher, of course, were colleagues in the world of diplomacy, and so there was certainly a relationship there. The two sides fought tooth and nail during the day, but as Darrell Bristow will tell you, there were occasional 11 p.m. College Avenue meetups between the lawyers from the different sides just to talk over, as litigators do, after the day. And so I think that we all had a certain appreciation, both sides, for the unique activities we were engaged in. And so that led to sort of a commonality between us that in many ways transcended the differences.
From a model for the present, for the future of organization, how did the secretary, given the very short timelines here and the rather unique character and complexity of this issue, how did he bring the team together?
He knew from the beginning and set out a organizational structure within about the first 2 days of how we should do it. So, of course, the legal mattered a lot, but he also understood, and we had a terrific group of people on the ground in the counting houses, some lawyers, some political folks, some communicators, looking at the individual ballots and knowing how to do that. He had a communications setup and structure led by Margaret Tutwiler, his old-time friend. He had a strategy group that was Bob Zellick and Josh Bolton, who
It's
led
a recreation
It's
of a miniature office of the secretary.
in many ways, yes, and it really, because of the familiarity and skill set of the
Right.
people he brought, it really helped expand it. And he had the legal team divided up very astutely into all the different issues we would have to face. And there were some 60 filings, separate court cases, I think, between the state and federal courts. So there was really specialization and then a very kind of rewarding communal discussions that would take place between the lawyers. And it really became a team of rivals and was among the most sophisticated, high-level types of discussions and strategy that I think any of us had been a part of.
How did you balance between national level folks coming in and Florida people?
Great question, and always a challenge for any political campaign, for example, on how you did that. I think what Secretary Baker did and emphasized was that we all had one mission, and we all had to be dedicated to that mission of making George W. Bush the next president. And when people got a little bit too full of themselves, there was a talking to. But everyone, I mean, again, was really conscious and almost overwhelmed by the stakes involved and the historical nature of the whole recount. And I think that made it easier, as well as Secretary Baker setting an example for melding people together.
So all of this is very much like a complex three-dimensional chess game. What were the key moves, the key decisions, strategies that led to the outcome that you achieved?
I think there were a number of things that really helped. Number one, we had more votes. We had more votes on election night. We had more votes after the machines were recounted automatically. We had more votes all the way through. In any recount, the team that's ahead wants sort of the law as it exists to be followed, and the side that's behind wants looser rules so more ballots can come in. The strategy was really set by the words that were on every single voting machine in the state of Florida, which said, if you want your vote to count, you got to punch the punch card, the Chad, all the way through. That was the Florida law, and that was on every single voting machine. If that standard had been stuck to entirely, we felt, we would have won easily. So we were very much for preserving what the Florida law was in that situation. And that drove all our strategies in all of the 60 court
So you
cases.
started out advantaged in a certain sense.
Narrowly, but advantaged.
Advantaged. Other critical factors?
Well, the people involved, certainly, I think, was a very critical factor. I mean, we drew on the Federalist Society and their nationwide talent of lawyers. And certainly we brought in lawyers from around the country who proved to be a huge, huge bonus. I mean, we had a third of the current Supreme Court down in Florida helping out in the recount. A number of people have gone on to be cabinet officers and governors and elected officials. I mean, it really was an incredible collection of talent. And with Secretary Baker's ability to lead a large number of folks like that, I think that really paid off. And again, we were in the position of being ahead, so upholding the law was what we sort of drove as a strategy.
Let's talk about mechanics. In the aftermath of Bush v. Gore, what changed in terms of the physical mechanics of the manner of voting? Are punch cards still used?
No, they are not. Look, one of the positives that came out of the recount was that kicking open of the hood of American elections and seeing that sometimes there's a little corrosion on the battery cables once you kick open the hood. And so there were improvements made. I mean, the Help America Vote Act was passed in 2002, implemented in 2003. That was a much needed transfusion of funding for the U.S. election system that I think made it better. Punch cards machines were eventually phased out. The state of Florida really led the way in producing model legislation for how to run good elections. And they run among the best elections in the country today, although that certainly wasn't the case in 2000. I think Bush versus Gore in the Florida recount gave a much larger appreciation to people about voting. And while there were certainly partisan overtones as part of that, the actual act of voting and making opportunities available was much more obvious. The Carter-Baker Commission was an important follow-on to take those lessons learned and transpose them. I think one of the other things that you learn about the American election system is that we made a policy decision 250 years ago to practice a fierce federalism and to have very local elections. So people from each community run those elections. And that's been a huge strength over the years. But it also, when you have somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 jurisdictions, nobody quite knows how many, you have inconsistencies. And so the equal protection part of the Bush versus Gore litigation was that you have to count similar ballots the same, is kind of a ticking time bomb today in American elections. And the smart election administrators, like in your first panel, know that we need to do something to make things a bit more consistent so that all voters have the same opportunities. Some of that money has gone to improving voting machines, but there's still a lot of different voting machines and different ages of voting machines depending on the jurisdiction you're in.
Let's follow up on what you just said, the fierce federalism that has produced the very local voting structures that we have. Two things are under deep challenge right now. The legitimacy of mail-in ballots, whether a state may send out ballots itself to every registered voter, as opposed to the voter initiating the process themselves, and then the deadline for receipt of ballots to be counted, the California, to cite the in extremis case issue. Against the charge, every vote that is in by election night, midnight 1, 2 a.m., That's it. No more counts. Where do you see this going?
The U.S. Supreme Court will be dealing this term in a case brought against Mississippi on the issue of whether mail ballots can be received after Election Day, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day. So it's going to go whatever the way the Supreme Court says, I think. The fierce federalism comes from Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution that says the states get to determine the time, place, and manner of their elections. That includes all the issues that you said. And there is that long, long tradition of letting the states essentially be the laboratories of democracy and knowing what works best in their jurisdictions. So I think that there are policy arguments that will take place on all those issues that you mentioned. But my guess is that we will still continue to recognize differences between states, as the Constitution says. The policy questions are going to be part and parcel of our dialogue for a while.
You want to opine on where the court is likely to come down on the issue of postmark versus receipt?
Judging where the Supreme Court's going to go is always dangerous. As an analytic matter, I would say that the black letter language of Article 1, Section 4 is pretty clear. And to the extent originalism still breathes, then I suspect states will be able to do different things. Policy debate's pretty different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the receipt of ballots after Election Day really creates much of the Petri dish sort of problems that we saw in 2020 with the delay in voting. It is not clear from the political science research that allowing ballots to come in after Election Day actually enfranchises a whole lot more people. You can move up the day that absentee ballots start so that voters have the same amount of opportunities. So that I think that policy debate is still going to go on. Mail ballots are obviously an issue that will continue to be debated among the states. Certainly a lot of discussion of them today. I was really interested to see that in the Tennessee special congressional election that just took place, where a 22-point Trump district was won by the Republican by 9 points, 40% of that candidate's votes came from early and mail voting, so that the notion of which political party kind of benefits from this, which is the root of all the fighting and legislation, is going through a little bit of a transition.
Yeah, you don't want to be hoist on the petard of striking down early voting, mail voting, only to discover whatever your partisan identification is,
Right.
You've just cut off.
Well, it's very interesting. Yes. And if there's ever another Florida 2000, which we all hope there's not, it is interesting to know the way the bases of the political parties are changing these days. And so many sort of non-college educated blue-collar voters who are traditionally Democratic are now Republican. They tend to be low propensity voters. Many of the laws that Republicans are passing put up barriers to low propensity voters. That transition of the bases of the party has not really been embraced by the parties in the legislation that they're trying to pass in different states. So I think that's going to play out in an interesting way.
2020 to 2025, the sophistication by both parties of the quantitative analysis, the statistical endless crunching of micro numbers, which are accessible now in a way that they were not 25 years ago, to determine on all the issues you and I have just been talking about where the party is best advantaged or disadvantaged. That's something very new.
Yeah, it's very new, and you see it manifest itself in many different ways. I mean, the problem with all this statistical analysis, the Achilles heel, if you will, is that they are accurate for the past election. But son of a gun, sometimes people change their minds over the course of a 2-year period, 5-year period.
So Billy balling the national electoral process doesn't always produce your series victory.
No. Well, the current redistricting process that
Yep.
you're going to hear about in the next panel will be an interesting test of that, because both parties are working for their own advantage. As an old redistrictor in a previous life, you can draw districts that you think are absolutely safe, but populations change and voters' attitudes change. And what may be a sure seat from the 2024 election may not be so safe in 2026 and beyond, despite the inability to crunch numbers.
And you mentioned a phrase which I think cannot be overstated: propensity of voting. You may have a theoretical voter base who, for a national election inspired by a national candidate, come out to vote. Will they for other national candidates? Will they for local senatorial House candidates? That's it. And what are you doing through redistricting? Are you pinking, or purpling a district that was clearly going to be blue or red?
Yes.
Where does it all come out?
A really good question. If you're an incumbent in one of those pink or purple districts, you get a little nervous about what the map drawers may be doing.
Yeah, we shared it at dinner last night. It was at a bipartisan conference to take a look at the 26 elections, and not much speculation beyond that. And the general view from both parties' representatives were redistricting may be a wash. And if not a wash, maybe just 1, 2, or 3 seat difference, if that. This is not a slam dunk.
No,
by any means.
And just imagine the recounts that might be held in those newly drawn congressional districts with all the administrative challenges that could be, or voters placed in the right districts, and the time deadlines that you have for the start of a new Congress, and fewer contested seats and narrow margins. And perhaps the state lets its ballots come in really late that could be outcome determinative for control of the House.
These deadlines in the 13 or so states that are theoretically going to contemplate at least redistricting are getting awfully tight now. And if you adjust them, are there going to be challenges to that adjustment? How far can you run this up to the primaries without getting into courts?
Indeed.
Over all of this?
And of course, the Supreme Court is also considering a decision on the Voting Rights Act. And that could create unconstitutional districts.
Let's talk quickly about that. The Voting Rights Act, the case before the court, what implications could come from that in terms of next year?
Well, who knows is the question. There is a principle in the law sometimes invoked, probably not really consistently invoked by the courts, called the Purcell principle, that says that anything that is too close before an election should be put off to the next election. It isn't clear how that might bump up. I mean, after all, if you're declaring districts unconstitutional, then they're unconstitutional. You're not supposed to run or use unconstitutional creations.
But
you've got the Purcell principle. So there are some, I'm certainly not going to predict how that's going to come up, but there you've got some fairly difficult issues to grapple with.
So another factor, quite uncertain in terms of both outcome and impact, coming up. And when is that judgment expected?
Well, the answer is by the end of June, when whenever they want.
Whenever they want. We've had out of the ordinary elections twice in the last 25 years, in 2000 and in a very different manner in 2020. And I don't want to confuse or confabulate the two different situations. You want to talk about what those differences were, their impact, and how you've talked about 2000 rather. How can the issues raised in 2020, which are inherently partisan and political, be addressed as we look to 28?
A really interesting question. I mean, first of all, there are real differences between 2020 and 2000. Like 2000 was really close. 2020, narrowest margin was 11,000 votes in a state. You don't make up 11,000 votes in a recount. What 2020 did was challenge the accuracy of some of the basics of the electoral system, as well as public confidence in the outcome of the electoral system. So I think it behooves all election officials to be very careful with their voter registration lists, with how they do mail voting, with basically doing all the logic and accuracy tests which they do with their machines to be sure the machines are tabulating accurately beforehand. And those issues will become part of 2028. The public confidence part is perhaps even more important. And I think that election officials have really responded to the challenges of their systems not being reliable in some pretty positive ways. There's far more transparency because there was a need for it, with election officials sort of opening up the doors to the election offices, letting people kick the tires of the election system, doing Ask Me Anything town halls.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the downside is election officials, who are our most dedicated public servants, I think, are subject to threats and harassment like they've never been. But they have responded with being open and transparent, which is really important. And it behooves people who have doubts about the reliability of elections to get out and actually participate in those elections, to become poll watchers or election officials and see how the system actually works. There are, roughly speaking, 11 stages of the election process. And each one of those stages has a series of safeguards in it to guard against all the mistakes that might take place. It is important for election officials to explain it and for people who doubt the reliability of systems to kind of get off the couch, turn off the TV, and go look for yourself.
If there were to be, and I think you may differ from this, the broad assumption is if the Republican presidential candidate loses in 28, there will be challenges across the nation to virtually every aspect of voting. How does the system, if it is the system, respond to that?
I think what I mentioned about increased transparency and explanations on a new scale of how things work is very, very important. It is also important for community leaders to take it upon themselves to do some kicking of the tires of the election system and be prepared to see if they find flaws.
Yeah, let's go another 10
And in addition to sort of taking a look at what's going on, is to be able to raise questions and ask the election official what may be wrong, but to support the system if those questions are answered.
You are responding in a very lawyerly structured legality, guilt, practical fashion, as opposed to if I lose, it's fraud. And now let's find, accuse, and single out the fraudsters everywhere, because no election can ever come out that's fair against the Republican presidential candidate. What do you do if that mentality continues?
Well, I'm not sure it'll be one-sided, first of all. Let me say that. I mean, there were recounts requested in 2016 by Jill Stein, which the Democratic presidential candidate joined in late November. So this is not a one-party phenomenon. Look, I think it's going to have to be dealt with pretty directly. I mean, it is sort of a rule of law issue. This is why I gave you a legal answer, because I think that's what ultimately matters. I think 2000 was the example of a very contentious situation that ended peaceably, and I think that's got to be the model. I mean, one of the when you talk about the acerbic nature of a lot of these discussions today, 100% true on the national level. I think we do some work in contentious election jurisdictions today. On the local level, people are not so heated as they are nationally, that on the community, local level, people want peace and prosperity in their communities. That is a higher priority for them. And so I think that actually community involvement and discussion is a real key to being able to combat that.
Role of the Supreme Court in all of this? Tough one.
They are the final deciders. I will say in 2020, when there were a number of cases that could have been contentious, the Supreme Court and the lower courts, I thought, all did the right thing in all those cases. But the Supreme Court could again become the fulcrum. I think that's the institution that should handle it.
Partisan politics are the bread and butter of America since virtually the foundation of the country. But a new phenomenon, or a phenomenon which has been growing for many decades, of polarization of a demographic, economic, social, physical, geographic location character. The precinct by precinct red and blue maps with very little shift or change between. That's been solidifying since 2020. And that's got a profound impact in all of this.
Yeah, I think you can trace it back long before 2020. I mean, this has been a long phenomenon. Probably the breakup of the Solid South politically after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were passed. University of Texas demographer Bill Bishop's written a really excellent book called The Big Sword, describing how over the last 6 decades, I guess, demographically having nothing to do with politics, people are moving into communities with people more like themselves. The more homogeneity in the country, meaning less contact with people not like themselves.
Based on the two-sided coin of income and education, education and income. And Bowling Alone, different sociological look. Again, a phenomenal book I would recommend.
Yeah.
To all of the desocialization, decommunitization of America. No more bowling leagues, no more Oddfellows, no more Masons. People bowl alone. And bowling alone, you don't mix. You don't see others in that same sense.
And so that leads to sort of one-party rule in a lot of states. Trifectas, I think, in 27 of the 50 states now, or even more than that, 37 in the 50 states. That leads to sort of what the political minority in a state managed to do for representation. Polarization is a huge problem. Again, is the solution a national solution, or does it have to really take place on the community level? 2028 will be potentially an inflection point on this issue for us.
If there were to be another Baker-Carter Commission, and I asked you the question, should there be, what, in your view, are the most important things that commission could do, at least could recommend between now and 28?
between now and 28, it's going to be difficult to implement. So this may be a
looking at 30.
A longer term project. So the issue of uniformity among jurisdictions is, I think, important. That the equal protection argument that was raised. So something that does appreciate our federalist roots, but creates more consistency within states of the types of equipment that's used, from everything from voter registration to the actual counting machines. The accuracy of voter registration rules is really important.
Mhm.
I know Carter Baker and our Presidential Election Commission both recommended that states cross-pollinate their voter registration lists to make them more accurate. There were efforts to do that. They've sort of run on political rocky shoals lately. I think that's crucial. I think, look, the funding issue that the Kennedy Center and the Dole Institute raise is absolutely fundamentally important in terms of getting quality voting equipment throughout the country to give people opportunities. I think there are policy issues that increase confidence of voters in the system. The Carter Baker Commission dealt with voter registration. That is still an issue. Nothing gives people more confidence in the accuracy of elections, according to polls, than that. I think generally more understanding of how the system works and the safeguards in it that I mentioned would be really important to talk about by a commission. But there is, the Carter Baker Commission made a huge impact on the country, and we're probably at a position where we could use one again.
Could you talk just a minute about the rocky shoals that sharing cross-pollination of voter lists registrations have run upon? Why? Why has that happened?
Well, when I break it down and explain it, you'll say they're not terribly good reasons. It got caught up in the partisan crossfire. There was a portion, this is all done on something called ARIC.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a group of states, I think there were probably 31, 32 at its height, who joined it. There was a provision they had in that said everyone who you could find who wasn't registered to vote and was eligible should be mailed voter registration materials. And that became a political hot button within the organization. And so a number of Republican states have now pulled back, which would seem to be a little bit of a contradiction from the desire to have accurate voter lists. But here we are.
This has been Baker Briefing, where we make news make sense. This podcast is brought to you by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which delivers nonpartisan policy research on the most pressing issues facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zemel. Audio production was led by Kevin Young. Learn more at bakerinstitute.org, and thanks for listening.